The street was quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. It was just past midnight when Chief Mark Reynolds turned onto his street, exhausted from a 12-hour shift filled with back-to-back calls, endless paperwork, and the usual chaos of running a police department. All he wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and uninterrupted sleep. Instead, he slammed his brakes the moment he reached his driveway. A massive tow truck was blocking it. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor's car had broken down, and they were using his driveway as a temporary tow spot. Then his gaze landed on the smug-looking man standing beside the truck, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Kevin, the HOA enforcer. Or, as the neighbors like to call him, the wannabe cop. Mark exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Not tonight. Mark stepped out of his car, his badge still clipped to his belt. You want to move this truck out of my driveway? He asked, keeping his voice even. Kevin looked him up and down, as if assessing some random civilian. You should have paid the fine, bud, Kevin smirked, tilting his head toward the empty space where Mark's personal car had been parked that morning. Mark's stomach dropped. A slow, creeping realization settled in. His car was gone. Towed. Kevin chuckled, lifting his clipboard dramatically. Let's see. Unpaid fine of $79. Mark blinked. $79? Yeah, we sent notices. No payment. No warning needed when you ignore him. What? Mark clenched his jaw. I was at work all day. Kevin shrugged, flipping through his clipboard like it was some sacred text. Not my problem. Rules are rules. Mark reached for his phone and checked his emails. Sure enough, buried under spam and work notifications was an email from the HOA. Subject, final notice, urgent past due balance $79. Sent, 3 hours ago. He let out a slow breath through his nose, looking up at Kevin, who was still grinning like he had just won some battle. The tow truck driver, a bulky guy in his 40s, leaned against the truck, looking bored. Where's my car? Kevin tapped the clipboard. Impound lot. You can get it back for $250 plus storage fees. Mark's eye twitched. So let me get this straight. He stepped closer, voice low. You towed my car over a $79 fine before I even had a chance to read the email, and then blocked my own driveway with this truck? Kevin's smirk widened. That about sums it up. Mark cracked his neck. He had arrested gang leaders with less arrogance than this guy. He pulled out his phone and dialed non-emergency dispatch. A young officer picked up. Hey, it's Reynolds. I need a traffic obstruction unit at my residence. Kevin's smirk faltered slightly. Whoa, what do you think you're doing? Mark stared at him. Getting your truck moved. Legally. Flashing red and blue lights filled the street within minutes. 2 uniformed officers stepped out. The senior officer, Sergeant Miller, approached with a confused expression. Chief, what's going on? Kevin's face went pale. Chief, Kevin stammered. Mark crossed his arms. Oh, didn't I mention? I'm the chief of police. Kevin visibly swallowed. The tow truck driver straightened, suddenly a lot more interested in the conversation. Mark gestured toward the tow truck blocking his driveway. This vehicle is obstructing my property. I'd like it removed immediately. Miller turned to Kevin, his voice all business. You got a permit for this tow? Kevin fumbled with his clipboard. It's HOA policy, sir. Miller raised an eyebrow. Policy isn't law. You have no legal authority to impound a vehicle without following city ordinances. Mark turned back to Kevin, his eyes locked onto him. You were saying something about running this neighborhood? Kevin's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Yeah, Mark smirked. That's what I thought. The real fun started when Miller's partner ran the tow company's credentials. The radio crackled. Sergeant, the tow company's permit is expired. They've been illegally towing vehicles for 6 months. Kevin's face turned white. Mark tilted his head. That's a crime, Kevin. The tow truck driver threw up his hands. Whoa. I just do what they tell me. Mark gestured toward the officers. Then I suggest you start cooperating. Where's my car? The driver fumbled for his phone, sweating. I'll call the lot. They'll bring it back now. Kevin's panic was growing. Hold on. Let's just talk about this. Oh, we'll talk. Mark stepped closer, voice cold. About why you think you can extort homeowners with fake fines. About why you target certain houses while letting your buddies slide. Kevin took a step back, his bravado gone. It's not like that. I swear. Before he could finish, headlights flooded the street. A black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Richard Vaughn, the HOA president himself. Unlike Kevin, Richard had a slick, politician-like confidence. He adjusted his tie, surveying the situation. Chief Reynolds, he greeted smoothly. I didn't expect to see you here. In uniform. Mark turned to him, unimpressed. I wasn't expecting to find my driveway blocked and my car stolen, but here we are. Richard barely blinked. This is all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can handle this internally. Mark chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Oh, you mean like you handle everything else? He tilted his head. Illegally? Through threats and fines. Richard's jaw tightened. Mark turned to Miller. Pull the HOA's financial records. Let's see what other illegal activity we can find. For the first time, Richard Vaughn looked nervous. And Mark knew. The HOA was about to fall. Mark wasn't the kind of man to let things go. By the next morning, he had his team pulling every record tied to the HOA, the tow company, and the so-called fines homeowners had been paying. And what he found? It was worse than he expected. The HOA wasn't just issuing fake fines. They were running a full-blown extortion racket. Over 200 homeowners had been forced to pay bogus penalties over the last 3 years, and nearly half of those funds had been reallocated to a private bank account, an account belonging to Richard Vaughn. Mark stared at the evidence, his jaw tightening. It was time to bring this house of cards down. That afternoon, Mark arrived at the next HOA meeting, except this time, he wasn't alone. 2 of his officers flanked him as he walked into the room, where Vaughn and his inner circle of board members sat smugly at the front. Vaughn gave his usual fake politician smile. "Ah, Chief Reynolds. I assume you're here to clear up last night's misunderstanding?" Mark didn't smile. He tossed a folder onto the table. "That's every illegally issued fine from the past 3 years," he said, voice cold, "along with proof of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power." The room went silent. Vaughn's smile faltered. "Now, let's not make any rash. Save it." Mark pulled out a warrant. "Richard Vaughn, you're under arrest." Gasps filled the room as his officers moved in, cuffing Vaughn's wrists. One of the board members shot to her feet. "This is insanity. You can't just—" Mark cut her off. "I suggest you sit down before I pull your financials next." She sank back into her chair without another word. With Vaughn in custody, panic spread through the HOA ranks. Kevin vanished overnight. Board members resigned en masse. And the city council called an emergency vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. It was over. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. 2 months later, Mark sat on his porch, watching the sunset, a cold beer in hand. Vaughn had been sentenced to 5 years for fraud. The HOA? Gone. And best of all, his neighborhood finally felt like home again. As his phone buzzed with messages from grateful neighbors, Mark smiled. Some fights are worth having. And this one? He'd won.